Well, good morning. I tell this story to start out with permission. It's a story about my wife when she was a kid, when she was in second grade, is that right?
Something like that.
When she was in second grade, she was attending Mountain Mission School in Grundy, Virginia, where her mom worked. Her dad was a minister in the area. And she had a teacher, she was struggling with math, and she had a teacher who called her stupid in front of the entire class as a second grader. A lot of her self-doubt issues that she deals with even today goes back to that time. And the reason I say that is because in our house, we don't use the word stupid very lightly because of that. And if you'll notice that my title for this morning is Stupid Won't Fix Stupid. So I want you to know that I don't use those terms very lightly. I don't just throw that word around. Stupid won't fix stupid. And what we're talking about is the idea of temptation and how when temptation strikes, we can do one of two things. We can flee from it, or we can think that we can get through it by acting stupid and falling into it. That's the point this morning. That's what I'm getting at. And again, I just wanted you to know that I don't use that term very lightly because it means something to my wife. And I asked her this morning, and she told me I could tell you the story behind it. So if you ever hear either one of us use the word stupid, you know there's something behind it. It's not just a casual word that we throw around. Now, we're continuing our Joseph series, God Will Make a Way. And again, we're talking about temptation. And temptation pops up in front of us in a lot of different ways, doesn't it? And sometimes it feels like temptation is something that we're tempted with. Oh, it's not going to be a big deal if we give into it. No one will ever know if we fall into it. No one will ever know if we make the choice to do what we're being tempted. I like to think of it this way. If you're driving around at night and you come to a stoplight, a red light, and it just seems to be holding forever and ever and ever, but there's no other cars around, it's very tempting to go ahead and run that red light, isn't it? No one's ever going to know. But every once in a while, there's going to be a cop sitting right around the corner, and when you run that red light, you're going to get busted for it. That's why temptation can be such a dangerous thing. So when we left Joseph last week, we left the story. His brothers had just sold him into slavery. He had arrived in Egypt. We saw that he was being taken down to Egypt, but we hadn't really seen his full fate yet. Okay, we did jump ahead to the end of the story to know that he realized in the end that God was using that for good, but we didn't really talk about all the details. And things get worse. They get a lot worse for Joseph before they started getting better, before he got to the point that he fully realized that God had used all of this for good. Some of the passages that we looked at last week dealt with the idea of crisis in our lives and how when we go through crisis that it helps us to grow. And we kind of talked about that in Sunday school this morning with James. When we go through hard times, it makes us grow. It allows us to grow. One of the passages that we could have looked at last week, but we didn't, comes from Romans 5, 3 through 5. Again, Romans 5, 3 through 5. And my bookmark came out, so I'm going to read it from this. Sorry. It says, "Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. Hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." So Paul's telling us again that through our sufferings, through our trials, we gain perseverance. And that perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope. And these are all things that we see that Joseph will need to develop to be able to do what God is calling him to do, to see that he gets through the things that we're going to be looking at today and over the next few weeks that he goes through. But to begin with, we're going to look at our main text for today, which is Genesis 39, verses 1 through 19. And it will not be on the screen because it is a longer passage. So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn to it. Genesis 39, 1 through 19. And it says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials and captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned." So it sounds like things are getting good for Joseph, but that's not the full story. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So he is the top man in Potiphar's house besides Potiphar. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he is entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. So this wasn't a one-time temptation. It was an ongoing thing that she was trying to get. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home, and then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave that you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." And when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your servant treated me." He burned with anger. So now we find Joseph in Egypt. He's been bought for the second time as a slave. The Ishmaelites had bought him from his brothers, and now they had sold him to the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. His world had to be spinning at this point. He thought he was something important and thought his brothers were going to bow down to him. Now he's been sold twice. He's away from everything he's known. He has no idea what's to become of him. He doesn't speak the language. It's an unfamiliar culture. But our passage reads that everything he did, the Lord was with him, and he prospered because of it. He found favor in Potiphar's eyes. Everything he did in Potiphar's house was blessed, and Potiphar's wealth grew because of it. And Potiphar promotes him and makes him his personal attendant. In other words, there is no one in the house of Potiphar that is above Joseph except for Potiphar himself. In fact, he's in charge of everything that Potiphar owns. And things are actually looking up for Joseph. Enter Potiphar's wife. We don't even know her name, but she's a major character in the story of Joseph. She finds Joseph attractive and she invites him to bed. And Joseph has a huge choice to make here. And he could go to bed with his master's wife, and no one will ever know because she's not going to tell anyone. Or he can try to remain pure to God's teaching. And it's not as easy of a decision as we would like to make it out to be, as we would like to think it was for Joseph. The choice was not easy. We're talking about a young man that was sold at the age of 17. And we don't know how much time had passed from the time he was sold to the time that Potiphar's wife starts trying to get him. But we can guess at best he's in his early 20s. It's not a lot of maturity yet. It would have been easy for him to fall into that temptation. This is also a man that's separated from his entire family, his entire culture. Everything that he knew was gone. And the hope of ever being free probably never crossed his mind at this point. Again, it would have been easy for Joseph to succumb to that temptation. I know of a lot of people that would have fallen to that. But he makes the hard choice. He stays faithful to God. He stays pure to God, and he turns Potiphar's wife down. He dismisses her advances and does what he would call, or what we would call, the right thing. He faces temptation. He looks it in the face. He stands straight up to it. He rises above that temptation. But unfortunately for Joseph, the temptation doesn't just die off at that point. It continues. Potiphar's wife continues to try to tempt him. And when he continues to turn her down day after day, she gets mad about it. And you all know a woman that's mad is not an easy thing to deal with, is it? Potiphar's wife is so mad that he's turned her down over and over again that she sets him up and lies to her husband about it. She claims that he's the one that's coming on to her and sets him up as he's the bad guy. She claims that he's tried to seduce her instead of the other way around. And Potiphar's furious, and I can understand where he's coming from too. We'll see next week what he does to Joseph because of this accusation. But I will tell you this, at least there's some indication that Potiphar may not believe his wife completely, because he could have easily had Joseph killed just for the accusation of coming on to his wife, but he chooses not to do that. So there may have been at least a little doubt in Potiphar's mind as to what actually took place, because he doesn't have him killed immediately. So we talk about all of that, and we look at the question, what is it from this passage that we can learn from Joseph? And there's a lot that we can learn from Joseph. Joseph faced temptation, and he didn't give in to it. That's a big thing. Joseph faced temptation, faced a hard temptation, and he didn't give in to it. That's something that I think we all struggle with from time to time. Temptation pops up, and it would be so much easier just to go ahead and give into that temptation. No one's ever going to know. It'd be easy to go ahead and run that red light. But is that the right thing to do? There's a passage that comes to mind, and it's one that I think is often misused and misquoted. Some use it to state that God won't give us more than what we can handle. That's not what the passage says. 1 Corinthians 10, 12 through 13, Paul's writing, and he doesn't say that we won't be given more than we can handle, but he says that God won't tempt us beyond what we can handle. And he says, 1 Corinthians 10, 12 through 13, he says this, "So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." The lesson that we can learn from Joseph today is how to get beyond that temptation, how we can get beyond something that is tempting us. And I think that's a lesson that we can all use a refresher on from time to time, isn't it? 1 John 2, 15 through 17, This was one of my preachers growing up, one of his favorite verses, and it's become one of mine as I've learned more and more about it. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. Again, a longtime favorite passage that shows us three sources of temptation. It shows us that temptation or even sin that's in the world. So let's take a look at this, and then I'll try to explain it as best I can. But again, 15 through 17 says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." In John's view, here the sins and the temptations of the world boil down to three things. The first thing he tells us is the lust of the flesh, and that's not just talking about sexual sin, although that may be incorporated into it, but this is anything physical that takes our focus away from God. The lust of the flesh. It's the physical things that we're tempted by. The second that he lists is the lust of the eyes. In other words, this comes down to being slaves of lavish living. We want more and more luxury and bragging about the luxury that we have. We covet something that somebody else has because we want it. And the third is the pride of life. And this is basically trying to make ourselves out to being a lot more important than we are. We try to boil ourselves or put ourselves up on a pedestal and make it look like we're much more important than we really are. So those are the three categories, and I think when we start looking at that temptation that Joseph has to deal with here, we see all three of those pop up in our story. There are three things that Joseph does in the passage that we read as well, that I see of how he avoided giving into that temptation. So there are three things that we can take out of that. We'll take them one at a time. First, Joseph makes a point to focus on what he has, not on what he doesn't. In other words, he's thankful for what he has instead of looking and coveting something that he doesn't have yet. Temptation is so strong because it offers us something that we think we don't have yet, but we desperately want. When we focus on what we don't have, then that temptation has a foothold. Joseph took another approach. He looked at what he did have, and he was thankful for it. He was content with that. I don't know a lot of people in this world that are completely content anymore. We all want something better. And striving for something is not a bad thing, but when we let that get out of control to where we can't face temptation, that's when it comes to be a problem. He also knew that falling into this temptation was that he was facing could cost him what he already had. That's part of the risk of falling into temptation, isn't it? We lose what we already have because we're trying to get something that we think we need even more. Think about it this way. His response to Potiphar's wife gives us some insight into what he had. In Genesis 39, 8 and 9, he says, "But he refused. With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" That's a pretty strong response to temptation. He was able to face that temptation. He was able to look it dead in the face and realize that what he had was greater than what he was being tempted by. And we have to become self-aware in this sense to be able to do this. But when we're able to become self-aware, when we're able to realize that what we have is better than what we're being tempted by, we can look temptation in the face and walk away from it. Think about it this way. What do you have in your life that you value so much that you don't want to lose? Is it that great job, a spouse that you can't live without, something else? Well, when temptation pops up and you give in to that temptation, you risk losing what it is that you so dearly want to hang on to. Cheating or lying to get ahead at work could cost you that job. Having an affair or giving into lust and looking at something on the internet could cost you your marriage. What if you have a problem with alcohol and you take that first drink and it could ruin your life? Temptation tempts us with something that we think we desperately want, but we forget that giving in to temptation can cost us everything that we already have. And that temptation, even if we give in to it, will only satisfy for a brief time. And then we have to have more of it. And then we have to have more of it. And we have to have more of it. Joseph seemed to get that. The second thing that we see is Joseph focuses on God. He focuses on what he has and he focuses on God. And one of the things that he had was his relationship with God. But the last part of the verses that we just looked at shows that Joseph didn't want to sin against God. That was one of the reasons that he said no to that temptation. Giving into the temptation of going to bed with Potiphar's wife would have cost him a relationship with God. It would have been a sin against God, and he realized that. And Joseph wasn't ready to do that. He wasn't ready to give in and go against his God. And he didn't just leave this to chance. I think this is important. This was something that he had prepared for in his life. He didn't just leave it to chance and fight it at the time. He guarded his life from doing anything against God. This is something that he had prepared for in advance. So the lifestyle he chose to live long before that temptation reared its head. In a lot of ways, Joseph was cross-eyed. He had his eyes fixed heavenly. He was thinking of the things of God, not of himself. He had fixed his eyes on God in such a way that he was able to do away with temptation in his life. Just like Hebrews 12 tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus, he had fixed his eyes heavenly on God. He saw how everything he did in Potiphar's house was blessed by God because he was following what God had done. He knew that God would take care of him. And because God was taking care of him, he was not prepared to sin against God. I think we can put those things in place in our own lives before temptation ever hits. Joseph seemed to have that handle on resisting temptation. He was willing to stand and fight, but the temptation just didn't die and go away at that point, did it? It was persistent. It kept coming. Potiphar's wife kept pressing for what she wanted. And she was determined to have her way. It didn't matter what she had to do to get it. There came a point in the story in which Joseph had to just stand up, and instead of keep fighting, he had to flee that temptation. He had to put it out of his life, out of any of his control. He was down to two choices. Let Potiphar's wife have what she wanted or run away from it. To flee that temptation. He had fought as much as he was going to be able to fight. That's the third thing that we can learn from Joseph. When temptation proved to be too strong, he chose to flee that temptation instead of giving in to it. And it's the same thing for us. There's value in standing up and fighting. But there comes a point sometimes where we have to just walk away from it. You may have to get rid of a friend that is tempting you to go down the wrong path, or to walk away from a job that is tempting you to give into a moral situation that you don't want to do. There comes a time in which the only way to deal with temptation is to flee from it. That may not be the easiest thing to do, but sometimes that's all we can do. Don't let yourself be put into situations where temptation will have a chance to pop up. One of the things that Kelly and I try to do, and I challenge all of you, don't be alone with a member of the opposite sex that's not your spouse. Don't put yourself in a position where lying or cheating is something that you think you can get away with. Run from temptation. Genesis 39, 11, and 12, part of our story, it shows Joseph getting to this point. It says, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. Major problem. He was alone with Potiphar's wife. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. There are other scriptures throughout the Bible that support this idea of fleeing from temptation. First, the passage that we looked at earlier about God providing a way out of temptation seems to suggest that one of the ways is just to walk away from it. But there are others that are more concrete from Paul. Verses like 2 Timothy 2:22 that states, "Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart." And in 1 Corinthians 6:18, where Paul writes explicitly, "Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body." The fact of the matter is, Joseph had some very, very strong, heavy temptations to overcome. The three categories of temptation seem to come into play here. He's tempted in the flesh with sexual temptation. He's tempted with the lust of the eyes, or giving into the temptation of Potiphar's wife that he could have given him more wealth than he already had. And then finally, the case can be made for temptation of pride of life, in the sense that he could have used this temptation to brag about himself. He was desirable. He could have, but giving in to this temptation would have led to the illusion of being even more desirable. He could have said, "Look at me, Potiphar's wife wanted me. I went to bed with her, now everybody wants me," and pumped himself up even more. But he realized that this temptation was not going to go away. Even though he had made it clear that he was not going to give in to it, so he made the choice when he was cornered to flee. Like we stated earlier, this doesn't work out exactly the way that he thought it would. He thought he would flee it and it would be over. It didn't make the whole situation magically better, unfortunately. But he remained pure. He did what he needed to do. Even though he was accused of the exact thing that he fled from, he knew he did the right thing. His master was furious at him. So what's going to become of Joseph? Most of you know the story. Most of you know what happens. And we'll continue Joseph's story next week and see exactly what does happen to him as a result. But I think it's safe to say that most of us realize that things get worse for Joseph long before they get better. And that's sometimes the case with us. So what happens to us when we resist and we resist and we resist temptation, but then things seem to get worse, even when we don't give in to that temptation? Again, life as a Christian is not a promise of everything to go smoothly, is it? Think back to the story of Job. He didn't deserve anything that was given to him. It says he was a righteous man, but he resisted temptation to curse God. And things didn't automatically get better when he resisted that temptation either, did it? It got worse before it got better in the end. Things didn't automatically get better for Job. It doesn't automatically get better for Joseph. And guess what? It doesn't automatically get better for us either. Not all the time. But that's where our theme verse for this series comes from again. Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. With that promise in mind, if that promise from God, even when things go bad, we know that something good is going to come from it. We may never see that good. It may be good for somebody else. But something good is going to come out of your struggle. Flee from temptation, no matter what it costs you at the time, because God will turn this situation into something good for His purpose. And if you're truly trying to follow God, you want what's good for His purpose, not our own purposes. So again, we focus on what we have, not on what we don't. We focus on God, and we flee from temptation. Temptation can take away everything if we let it. If we fall into that temptation, it could take away our marriage, it could take away our job, it could take away our health, it could take away everything for a moment of pleasure. If you've never accepted Jesus, Jesus is the way that we fight that temptation. Jesus is the way that we fight it when we focus on Him and we realize that we have so much better from Him than what we could do on our own. If you've never accepted Him, now's the time to do so. Any decision you need to make. As we stand and sing The Way of the Cross Leads Home, number 697, we're going to sing all three verses.